Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Recess Can Wait, our Summer of Democracy virtual teach-in. I know that according to our clocks, it just hit the 2:30 p.m. marker on East Coast time. We'll give a little bit more time for folks to trickle in. But as we get started, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We would love to see your name, where you're joining us from, and your pronouns if you're comfortable. So we have Minnesota. Great. Thanks for joining us, Becky. Kentucky, California, Washington, Pennsylvania, Florida, New Mexico. Wow, okay, great. Missouri and Virginia have great representation from all over the country. So I'll just get us started. Again, hello and welcome everyone to our Recess Can Wait, our Summer of Democracy teach-in. This is just one of many events that we are doing in conjunction with the Declaration for American Democracy Week of Action, demanding that we prioritize voting rights over the Senate recess. My name is Alicia Guerreri. I'm the National Organizing Manager with the League of Women Voters, and I'm pleased to be joined with my colleague Dylan Vargas and Jesselyn McCurdy from the Leadership Conference. Again, I encourage folks to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat with your name, where you're coming from, and pronouns if you're comfortable. It's great to see, all of us from all over the country joining here today to talk about voting rights. Just an overview of what today we'll cover. We're going to look at key voting rights legislation, including the For the People Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and we're going to touch on DC statehood. We're going to close by providing some actions and things that folks can do and get involved with to really help support these efforts and to help strengthen our democracy. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jesselyn with the Leadership Conference to ground us in the moment that we're in today.
Thank you, Alicia. So today is an important day of commemoration. Today marks the 56th anniversary of when the Voting Rights Act, the original Voting Rights Act, was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. July 27th marked the 15-year anniversary of the most recent reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. And we find ourselves in a moment where we need the Voting Rights Act more than ever. Let me take you back to 1965. In that year, several voting rights activists were murdered in Philadelphia and Mississippi. These acts of violence gained attention. And even after those acts of violence, the unprovoked attack on peaceful protesters on March 7th at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, gained the attention of President Lyndon B. Johnson, and it became clear that the resistance of Southern legislators to voting rights to voting rights for Black and Brown people was not moving. The recalcitrance was still there, and so President Johnson issued a call for a strong voting rights law and had hearings after the incident on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Congress determined that the existing anti-discrimination laws were not sufficient to overcome the resistance by Southern lawmakers. And President Johnson signed into law on August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act. Voting in the, I guess the moment that I want to really ground us in is that we are in yet another moment of reckoning in this country. We are currently in an existential crisis around the ability after the 2020 election, in the large turnout in the 2020 election, around people of color and indigenous people and their ability to vote. What we have seen since the beginning of the year is over 400 bills introduced in state legislatures to turn back the clock, take us back to 1965. And we cannot let the strong showing and the enthusiasm of the 2020 election, and because the results did not come out in a way that some expected them to or wanted them to take us back and to a day when Black people, brown people, indigenous people did not have the right to vote freely. People in America have to stand up and tell the Senate to do their job. We're at a point where we have several pieces of legislation on the federal level that will address some of the barriers that are being thrown up and at the state level. And it is time for Congress to take those pieces of legislation past them so that we can continue to move forward in terms of allowing more people to vote rather than less people to vote. That should really be, in terms of our vision in this country around voting, we should be allowing as many people as possible and creating as many opportunities as possible to vote. But that's not what we're seeing within the past 6 months after this 2020 election. And that's really what we should be doing. So I'll turn it over to Dylan now to talk to us a little bit about one of the pieces of legislation, and I'll come back and talk about one of the bills that is related to the Voting Rights Act. But Dylan is going to talk to us about a little bit about the For the People Act.
Thank you so much, Esselyn. This was a great way to kind of ground us in this conversation, because you're right, we're really under attack of our voting rights and basic rights of our democracy. And one of the best things that we can do is pass the For the People Act. So the For the People Act was first introduced in the last session of Congress in 2019. Fortunately, it was stalled then, but we're fighting continuously for it until we get it passed. It represents the most expansive democracy reform agenda we have seen since the Voting Rights Act itself that we just talked about. Like I said, our democracy is under grave threat, and the For the People Act is one of the best ways that we can defend and expand upon it. You want to go to the next slide? So for the sake of the work, there's a lot because the For the People is so comprehensive, we like to break it down into 3 separate sections of what are so important. It does the expansions and reforms to voting rights, redistricting, and money in politics. These are all crucial to the For the People Act and advancing our democracy as a whole. So this is just the 3 sections we always love to focus on in our advocacy around this piece of legislation. Next slide, please. So like we said, the first piece of the For the People Act tackles the most basic American right, the right to vote. With voting rights under such widespread attack, the reforms in the For the People Act are more important than ever to champion. And the voting rights sections of the For the People Act are simply trailblazing. If you go to the next slide, we get to the specifics of what each voting rights reforms are. Again, these are only a few of them, but they're the key highlights. First, it requires the national implementation of automatic voter registration. Basically, automatic voter registration is when every eligible citizen who interacts with a designated government agency, such as the DMV, a public university, or the Social Security Agency, is automatically registered to vote, unless they specifically decline to register. Basically, this shifts the system from what it currently is now as an opt-in system to an opt-out process. Automatic voter registration on a national scale could add as many as 50 million new voters to the rolls. So that's just one simple way of vastly expanding participation in our elections. Next, it also makes online voter registration and same-day voter registration national. Same-day voting alone could increase voter turnout by 5 to 7%, which doesn't seem like a lot, but statistically that is a lot. That's millions and millions of Americans. Just these 3 steps on registration would make voter access so much easier and remove many of the barriers to voter participation. We saw the expansion of voter opportunities during the pandemic resulted in a historic turnout in this past election. Imagine this on an even larger scale with the For the People Act. This bill also makes steps to re-enfranchise formerly incarcerated individuals. It allows that if you were out of prison, living in the community, you get to vote in federal elections. And it also requires that states provide written notice to individuals with criminal convictions when their voting rights are restored. Because it's not enough just to restore them, they need to be made aware of this, and it needs to be actively given to them by this information by the government. They shouldn't have to search for it, because that just is another barrier. The For the People Act also requires that all states provide 2 weeks of early voting and early voting sites across geographic locations. Again, early voting is another way to make voting more accessible and give you more flexibility in your opportunities to vote. Lastly, again, not the last thing this does, but the last thing I would like to mention, the For the People Act tackles the issue of voter purges that have seen millions of Americans removed from the voting rolls for numerous illogical reasons. It mainly prohibits election officials from relying on a citizen's failure to vote in an election as a reason to remove them from the rolls. If you already are registered, why should your lack of participation be a reason for you to be removed? Maybe you had a family emergency that you had to miss an election or two. That should not mean you're removed from the rolls unnecessarily. And it requires that election officials provide timely notice for removed voters, as well as ample opportunity to remedy the registration before the election. Again, very much with the re-enfranchisement of previously incarcerated, it should be on the government and on these institutions to inform American people when they are removed and give them that opportunity to get back on the rolls and get back to be registered. These voter rights protections and reforms in place would revolutionize our elections and make them more accessible and increase turnout and ultimately elevate the voices of all Americans. Like I said, with so many attacks on voting rights across the country, these reforms seem simple, but are groundbreaking to increasing accessibility and voter participation and making sure our democracy lives up to its true promise. If you go to the next slide. So we talked about some of the voter rights reforms, but also a key part of our democracy is redistricting, which involves the drawing of maps and districts that govern the power of our representatives. And now, as redistricting is already underway, the reforms for redistricting within the For the People Act are more vital than ever. If we go to the next slide, I'll go to the specifics. First, the For the People Act requires that states use independent redistricting commissions to draw their congressional maps. Currently, the default in most states is to have redistricting controlled by the very legislatures involved in whose power is connected to the maps that they are drawing. This inherently leads to bias, corruption, and just the drawing of unfair maps very often and gerrymandering. But by transitioning to independent redistricting commissions, these are commissions that do not have any connection to the maps that they are drawn. They are just the one in charge of it. Their power is not governed by these maps. We are able to strip this bias from this process and make maps more fair. The For the People Act also ends what's called prison gerrymandering. Prison gerrymandering basically means that prisoners are counted as population in the community where the physical prison is and not where their real address is. The For the People Act, it gets rid of this and, like I said, ends as prison gerrymandering by making sure that prisoners are counted as populations in their last residence. The reason prison gerrymandering is often so detrimental is because it often outweights the rural community populations where the prisons are physically located and not other areas where the prisoners themselves are coming from. The For the People Act also imposes a uniform set of rules on how districts should be drawn. These universal standards would ensure that all maps are drawn using the same considerations and create more consistency across the process. Because right now, in the 50 states and the various jurisdictions. There are so many different ways maps can be drawn, so many different criteria to base it off. It's often so complicated and hard to keep track of. But with the For the People Act, this would center it in these national standards on clear mapping criteria. Another thing is some of these criteria include the banning of favoring or disfavoring political parties and the protections of community of interests. Finally, it also includes much more transparency in the process, requiring that these independent redistricting commissions, all their business is done in open public meetings and subject to oversight, requiring that any data and information that they create may be publicly available, and all official communications are subject to disclosure. Ultimately, S1 advocates for the three capstones of what redistricting reform: independent commissions, standardized criteria, and more transparency in the process. And again, having this accountable and transparent and fair redistricting process is the only way we can ensure a way to destroy gerrymandering and make sure our democracy is not carved apart in the redistricting process. If you go to the next slide. As we are already knee-deep in the redistricting year, how will these redistricting reforms within the For the People Act impact the current and future process? First, just kind of setting the groundwork of what the current status of redistricting looks like across all 50 states in DC. Only 19 states have some form of reforms that are included in the For the People Act, with only 8 having full independent commissions and 9 having some form of independent advisory or backup commission, with still the vast majority of states, 31 states, still granting total redistricting power to the legislators themselves. And as we explained, the institution of a national independent redistricting commissions are a crucial reform within the For the People Act. So instead of just 8 across the country, we would have 50 plus DC. But what if your state already has such a commission? People are often worried about that. The only impact that this would have is it would make sure that the commission adheres to the standards built into the For the People Act. It would not change the structure often. Some of these standards in the For the People Act include a multi-partisan composition, screening for conflicts of interest, publicly available applications, and ensure the commission takes public input. So again, if you already have an independent commission, as long as you adhere to the standards within the For the People Act, it would not alter the composition or makeup of your commission. Unfortunately, the independent commission provisions within the For the People Act would not actually come into place until the 2030 redistricting cycle. So it would not be in this redistricting cycle because it would be too hard to get a massive setup in this cycle, but we'd have a whole decade to get them set up for the next cycle. However, and depending on the timeline of passage of the For the People Act, the criteria that it builds, the standard criteria that I've been mentioning, would apply to this cycle. Again, only if it's passed within the next few weeks before I believe the fall. So again, these redistricting reforms are crucial to our democracy and are a great way to ensure that our maps are no longer drawn with this bias and that they represent the people themselves and not those in power. We go to the next slide. Okay, and like I said, the final piece of the For the People Act that we always like to highlight, again, not the final piece of the For the People Act because it's so incredibly comprehensive, is the money in politics section. If we go to the next slide. Since Citizens United, we have all seen how politics and election have become dominated by money and have made politicians more accountable to big corporations and donors than their constituents. In past elections, billions of dollars have been spent, all coming from these big businesses and select few millionaires and billionaires. More and more, it feels like a democracy can be bought and influenced only by the wealthy. But the For the People Act is doing something about this. The first thing it does to tackle this dark money influence is it instates a small donor public financing scheme. This ensures that the $1, $5, or $20 donations made by everyday Americans have more power in the system. Basically, the system works by having candidates opt in once they raise enough small startup donations to qualify for this program. When you donate to these participating candidates in small amounts from $1 to $200, the small donating financing, public financing piece would match that donation at a 6-to-1 ratio. That means if all you have to give is $20 to a candidate, they will actually receive $120 instead, which makes these small dollars more impactful in these elections, particularly for first-time candidates, candidates of color, and female candidates who may not have the network with these big money, dark money influences, but simply have a swell of local support. And importantly, this system is not funded by taxpayer money, but instead by a small surcharge on criminal and civil penalties assessed against corporate wrongdoers. So this small donor financing is a great way to ensure that the power of donations and the voices of everyday Americans matter just as much in our elections as those of the uber wealthy. The For the People Act also places rules around big dollar donations, ensuring that there is more transparency in the process. As you can see, we love transparency. The more we're aware of it, the more accountable everything is. It requires that all groups who spend significant sums on campaigns disclose the donors who pay for that spending, so we know where the money is coming from, and we know this can hold them accountable. It also changes rules governing online campaign ads, because typically they are treated differently than traditional media, except now in the modern era, they have often an outweighed influence, and being subject to such outdated rules makes it inherently problematic. In fact, it requires that the largest online platforms with over 50 million unique visitors per month to establish a public file of requests to purchase political ads. Again, injecting that transparency. It's all about transparency, especially when it comes to dark money. Finally, the legislation also strengthens the FEC, the department that is supposed to oversee and enforce campaign finance laws. First, it breaks through the gridlock at the agency that has prevented it from taking any action. It reduces the current number of commissioners from 6 to 5, with no more than 2 affiliated to any party, effectively requiring one commissioner to be a tie-breaking independent. Because under the current system, they're often gridlocked at 3 versus 3, and they get nothing done. But within this 5-person commission, now there is that opportunity for a tie-breaking vote. On top of this, it prevents commissioners from serving beyond their term expiration. In the current system, commissioners often serve beyond their term expiration, which does not allow for a lot of turnover, a lot of new voices in the process. And finally, it strengthens the FEC's power to investigate campaign finance violations and dismiss other frivolous complaints. So this is just some ways that the For the People Act tackle the dark money influence in our elections. If you go to the next slide. Now, I'm sure that a question that's on all of your minds is, what will the For the People Act do to combat the plague of anti-voter bills that we have seen surging across the country? The answer is that it can do a lot. The For the People Act will create a universal national standard that all federal elections must abide by. It sets minimum standards for reform that must be implemented across the country. And because many of these all of these anti-voter bills that have passed will not meet this national standard, they will be overridden by the For the People Act. And again, this is just a minimum standard. So if states want to have more early voting time or do more to expand voting rights, they are welcome to. The limits placed on, like I said, the limits placed on voting by mail, early vote, and same-day registration by these anti-voter bills will be reversed by the For the People Act. And this is why this bill is so crucial and why we can no longer sit back, but we have to move forward with it. If we go to the next slide. Okay, I believe I saw a comment about what is the future of the For the People Act. in the question. So currently, the bill for the People Act failed its first vote back in June, but this does not mean it's dead in the water. The For the People Act can be brought up as many times as it needs to ensure passage. And then shortly after that first vote, Senator Manchin released his outline for a slimmer down version of the bill. This outline had some new changes, removed some, but was a smaller version of the original bill. And currently the Senate is working on a compromise package in hopes of bringing more support for the eventual passage. And while there's a lot of speculation and rumors on what this new bill will and will not include, until it's officially released, I know I'm hesitant to discuss the specifics here because I don't want to be wrong and I don't want to mislead or misinform you. But we will stay observant and make sure we have as much information as possible as the bill comes. I'd like to pass it back to my colleague at the Leadership Conference to talk about the second piece of federal legislation that we are advocating for that will transform our democracy, the Voting Rights Advancement Act. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dylan. And I guess my first message to everyone today, in line with Dylan's ending remarks, is that the situation here in Washington around these voting rights bills is very, very fluid. And so, as Dylan said, that there is a new version of what we're calling a skinny version of S1 that has been, Senator Manchin from West Virginia has worked with Majority Leader Schumer on. We're not clear at the moment what that language is going to look like, but the situation is very fluid here. And this applies also to the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So the Voting Rights Advancement Act, you can change the slide, Alicia. The Voting Rights Advancement Act was a piece of legislation that Representative John Lewis introduced a few years before his death in response to the Shelby v. Holder Supreme Court decision, which said that sections 4 and 5 under the Voting Rights Act, which created a mechanism for the Department of Justice to review voting practices in jurisdictions that had a history of discrimination against minority voters. The Supreme Court asked the Congress to update the formula they use to determine which jurisdictions were eligible for that, what is quite frankly an extraordinary remedy. And that is, again, that the Department of Justice, whenever you make a voting change in your jurisdiction, if you are deemed to have a history of discrimination in a certain jurisdiction, whether it's local jurisdiction or entire state, the Department of Justice would review that voting change and determine whether or not it had a discriminatory intent or discriminatory effect. And so what the Supreme Court said is the formula that was used to determine the jurisdictions, or the geographic formula that was used to determine the jurisdictions that were subject to that extraordinary review, needed to be updated because it was at least 25 years old. And so that case was decided in 2013. Congress has not updated that formula. And that's one of the things that is the major part of the voting rights, John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, would be to create a new formula for any geographic changes, but also one of the other issues in it, that it would be to address known practices, what are called known practices of discrimination against voters. And so that's another piece of the legislation that is very important to combating voter suppression. And right now, that legislation, the most updated version of the legislation, is being drafted as we speak. But one of the things that has been going on for the past year or so is that, or at least the past 6 months or so since the beginning of this new Congress, but there were some hearings actually in over the past few years, is establishing the need for this extraordinary remedy of Section 4 and Section 5. And so what has been going on in Congress most recently is there have been hearings that have been held to establish some of the things that are going on the ground in states across the country that are resulting in people's voting rights being infringed. And so, for example, the Leadership Conference a few years ago released a report and updated it more recently, what we call Democracy Diverted. And we outlined the number of polling places that have been closed since the Shelby decision in 2013. And for example, a state like Texas has closed 750 polling places over the past 7 or 8 years after it was clear, based on the Shelby decision, that they did not have to get those types of changes cleared by the Department of Justice. And so you can imagine what happens if your polling place is closed on election day and you show up to it, and then and you may not show up in time to figure out where your actual polling place is. So these are things that are, this is the reason why the Voting Rights Act itself is important, but also an update of the Voting Rights Act is important as well. A more recent Supreme Court decision that we anticipate will be addressed as a part of the Voting Rights Advancement Act when it is introduced is the Brnovich versus the Arizona DNC decision. And that decision was handed down about a month or so ago. And it basically, the focus of that decision was around Arizona's practice around provisional ballots and Arizona's practice around allowing ballot collection. And basically, the Arizona law will not allow your vote to count if you cast a provisional ballot in a precinct that is not your precinct. And in terms of ballot collection, under Arizona law, there's only certain people who are able to collect ballots and give them to the department of the voting department. And one of the things that so the Supreme Court was or the DNC challenged those laws. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court found that those laws did not violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And so, and because of that, the more recent version, or the soon to be introduced version of the Voting Rights Advancement Act will likely have language in it to make clear that situations like that in Arizona are intended to be covered under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So right now, as I said, and I will wrap up now, there have been hearings that have been happening in both the House Administration Committee and the House Judiciary Committee to what we call lay the record or lay the groundwork for any challenge to a new Voting Rights Advancement Act. And the laying of the record, the purpose of the laying of the record is to be able to show the Supreme Court that there are still discriminatory practices that are going on out there in certain jurisdictions and more broadly just across the country. And because of that, there is still a vital need for the Voting Rights Act and more specifically, the coverage formula and Section 4 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which allows the Department of Justice to be able to review discriminatory practices and determine before the election, not after the election, that those practices had discriminatory intent or impact, and therefore make a decision about whether the state could move forward with those practices. So we anticipate that the bill will be introduced in September, probably mid-September, and we're hopefully very soon we'll have a vote on that bill after introduction. But it's the drafters of the legislation and that staff in the House Judiciary Committee are very conscious of being able to draft a bill that will be able to be held up to Supreme Court scrutiny. And with that, I will pass it to Alicia to talk about DC statehood.
Thanks so much, Jocelyn and Dylan as well. I do feel really honored to be here to present on this issue of DC statehood today in conjunction with the discussions on the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which are both historic pieces of voting rights legislation. I know too, we have in the chat and participants who are fully immersed in this fight for statehood. And DC has been fighting for statehood for decades. And although DC has a larger population than even some states, the district is not one of the 50 states. And so we have no senators, and our representative in the House of Representatives is a delegate. I think some folks may be familiar with her. Her name is Eleanor Holmes Norton. And she, as a delegate, has limited voting privileges. Delegates have typically a marginalized role in Congress, and their constituents, so me as a DC resident, are not represented in Congress in the same manner as most citizens. And again, I just want to emphasize that DC is more, we are more than Capitol buildings. We have a population of over 700,000 people. Again, that's more than Vermont and Wyoming. And we want statehood. We are real people with issues living here. And the lack of statehood not only means that we don't get a say on federal issues, but it means our voice, even on how DC issues are addressed, is impacted. So just kind of giving a little bit of an overview, because I think that this issue of kind of the fact that we have over 700,000 people disenfranchised is pretty remarkable. And we talk about DC statehood, but it's important to have a grasp of what it looks like and how it impacts people. Some background on how DC is made up. We have 8 wards that elect representatives to our DC council, along with 5 at-large members. And our mayor essentially functions like a governor, with many state and county functions as well as normal municipal tasks. The council passes legislation, the mayor signs it, but nothing becomes law until the congressional review period has passed without objection. And this can take months. With no voting representation in the House and not even a voice in the Senate, we are cut out of any decision-making at the national level. Our laws are often objected to by congressmen who want to showcase and win political points with their own constituents back home. And oftentimes the humanity of the people who live here is often lost. We also, as noted, our judges are appointed by the president. So we don't have that direct line of say, and it depends on who's ever in the White House. Statehood and representation matters because our ability to vote and have people in office who represent our priorities is tied to our health and our safety and our dignity. This year, for instance, DC's budget from the Biden administration, this is the first time in many years that there's not a prohibition against using local funds to support people with low incomes who need abortions. Another example, for several years, despite broad public support and advocacy and ruling in favor, we were prohibited from running a needle exchange program. And this was a program that DC residents both wanted and knew could serve the betterment and safety of our people. Yet, and after even being denied this program, we ended up with the highest HIV/AIDS infection rate in the country. The impact of lack of statehood is constant and it's rampant. This year, we all watched the deadly insurrection of white supremacists in the Capitol building. And because of our lack of statehood, our mayor had to wait for the Department of Defense authorization to deploy the National Guard to come to the aid of the Capitol in our own backyard. Had DC been a state, this obstacle wouldn't have stood in the way of saving lives. And I think another key thing that maybe folks in other places don't realize is that we in DC, we rely on your senators to make decisions about our lives. So they have a stake in these decisions and funding. And frankly, I don't think that's very fair. So I wanted to also contextualize how lack of DC statehood is no accident. And it's important that we frame it appropriately as this intense form of voter suppression exists because of and is rooted in racism and fear of Black political power. After the Civil War, Congress passed legislation that granted African-American men the vote. This was even before the 15th Amendment. And in 1868, the DC mayoral election, nearly 50% of registered voters were Black men. And that they were instrumental in electing local leaders who pushed school integration and passed anti-discrimination civil rights laws. But this period of Black suffrage and political power was short-lived because in 1874, Congress installed a board of commissioners composed of 3 appointed leaders to run the DC municipal government. And under this system, Congress exercised immense power over DC, which allowed, for instance, there are instances of Southern segregationists. They were able to enforce their own racial politics in the Capitol. Senator Theodore Bilbo, a Democrat from Mississippi, for example, declared that he wanted to be on the Senate committee on the District of Columbia so he could keep Washington a segregated city. After decades of activism and organizing by Washingtonians, and with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which did dramatically increase Black voting rights in the South, DC gained a non-voting delegate to the House in 1971 and home rule in 1973, which has continued to this day. Denying DC statehood is really centered in this racist history and holding on to white supremacist power in a lot of ways. So DC statehood to enfranchise voters. Now in 2021, we have seen HR 51 pass in the House and introduced in the Senate with a record number of original co-sponsors. It has also gotten its second ever hearing in the Senate, with the first being in 2014. By recognizing DC as a state, we can ensure the full rights and honor of the equal freedoms of every American, no matter color, party, zip code, race, really to make this where a country in place where we all have a say in the decisions that affect our families, communities, and country. I did want to just bring attention to this image in the proposed new state of Douglas Commonwealth. You know, we have our schools and churches and parks and playgrounds and movie theaters, concert venues, and everything. The S51 proposed retaining a federal district but doing so by creating one that only has the monuments and capital. So ensuring that we are not lumping in registered voters to disenfranchise. So right now, this full gray area is what the district currently looks like. And this carved out section of buildings that doesn't have current voters and people living quite right there would make sure that we are not continuing to disenfranchise so many people. And with that, we talked about this from the beginning. I think that it's really special that we are here on the anniversary of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, talking about these key pieces of voting legislation. In a lot of ways, we have been in this fight before and we have won. And when we think about all these bills together, it's not an either or. This is a fight for all. We're calling this our summer of democracy. I think I'll extend beyond that because these fights do. But we are here together. I think some folks also mentioned in the chat, there are things and actions people can do to keep up the pressure and get involved. So a couple of those things, what they look like. And Dylan, I'm going to ask you if you could drop some links in the chat. We do have an action alert to contact senators and tell them to pass the For the People Act. We do have that asterisk on senators because we do recognize that DC doesn't have senators. So we also at the same time encourage you to help us pass DC statehood and sign this petition to add your name to this calling. And finally, on August 10th, there's going to be a Democracy Can't Wait Day of Action. There's distributed actions, I think over 80 so far around the country that continue to keep up this drumbeat, like make sure that we're not losing key pieces of the For the People Act, making sure that our legislators are responding to us. So there's going to be constant ways for folks to really get involved. And another key part of this that I want to emphasize too is really bringing people along with you. We are here because of the people who came before us. And this is a really critical time to bring in your own personal networks, your friends, your families, loved ones, really to take action in this work with us as well. We do have a couple of minutes for questions in case folks have them. So if you can write your question in the chat or raise your hand, we can get to it. But thank you, everyone.
Awesome. I think I can take that on. We can open it up to some questions. While everyone kind of gathers themselves for questions, I saw 2 early questions that were written in the chat I would like to kind of address. So Larry Lipton a while back asked, is there anything in these bills to protect election results from being overturned? i.e. can elections be overturned if the bills are passed, or do we need additional legislation? And I'm going to say, unfortunately, we will most likely need additional legislation, as there is nothing within the current bill that I'm aware of, or even in discussion of the compromise bill, that will target specifically the discussion about overturning an election. Because when the For the People Act was initially introduced, the concept of overturning an election wasn't a mainstay in conversation. So it wasn't really included. So we will definitely need additional legislation to protect our elections even further. But this goes very far to ensuring that there is confidence in the elections by increasing participation and transparency across the entire process. So I hope that addresses that question. Does anyone else want to feel free to unmute yourself to ask a specific question if you need? I see Karen raising her hand. You're unmuted, so you can ask your question.
Hi, I'm concerned about the negotiations. I put a couple of things in the chat about it. Ongoing, I can understand about amending changing the legislation that's up before the Senate. Is there a plan in place to contact this network and others if there is a window of time to lobby our senators about what is being cut and what is being kept?
Yeah, so I can't speak for other organizations, but I know the league, we're planning to launch a blog post explaining the differences and what's in there, an action alert to send out to all of our members to talk to the senators about what you want. And if anything that we are advocating for is cut, we'll continuously advocate for it in other avenues as well. So the league definitely has plans to rapidly mobilize around all of this. We have a lot of stuff coming. And I know that and also our DFAT organization, also, we meet regularly at least 3 to 4 times a week. So there's a lot of rapid response coordination among national partners and local partners as well.
Yeah, because I know it will be tight. We can't be, it's just going to have to stay on top of it and have people really attuned to their contacts so that we can act in a window of time that I know is going to be short.
Yeah, rapid response is the name of the game.
Yeah, thanks.
Also, does anyone else have any other questions? I know there's a few in the chat. I can also go, but I want to give people the opportunity to speak up. Okay, I'll read off another question that was posted earlier and try to get an answer. So Mary Ann asked, if the For the People Act is passed, will it be stymied by lawsuits from anti-voter groups? And again, we expect that that will be the case. And in fact, when the bill was initially introduced, it wasn't really expected to be passed. It was mainly a messaging bill. But now with the expectation that it's going to pass, they have included provisions that's called constitutional girding, which makes it and grounds it in the Constitution to protect it against any legal challenges. So we expect there will be legal challenges, but there have been appropriate additions and revisions to the bill itself to ensure it protected from those, and it can pass constitutional muster in the courts. I saw another chat from Ann Anderson about Senator Ossoff's bill. Nothing that I'm aware of. We're really heavily focusing on S1 right now in the For the People Act, just because it's going to be constantly moving. But also to your comment, the For the People Act, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, and DC statehood are the 3 bills that we're really advocating for, and we're trying to make sure that they're never left out of the conversation. Every training we have that's on these bills all include all of 3. In fact, the For the People Act itself has language advocating for both the Voting Rights Advancement Act and DC statehood. While the language in there is not law-abiding, it just promises a commitment to get those other 2 passed as well. So even though all the focus right now seems to be on the For the People Act, we have not forgotten about the Voting Rights Advancement Act or DC statehood, because those are the 3 pillars of all our advocacy work.
And I also just wanted to, Jessalyn, if there are other perspectives and thoughts from the leadership conference that you want to share, or if you've seen other questions. I know sometimes the chat moves a little bit quickly. I know I've missed some things, but feel free to add your perspective and thoughts as well, because we are so grateful to have you here on with us.
Sure. I mean, I think the only thing that I'll at least initially add is that I know at the leadership conference, every communication that we send out, we make it clear that the For the People Act, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, and DC Admission Act, all 3 need to be passed together. And it's not an either or proposition in our mind. That, again, because the For the People Act addressed certain voting practices that the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act doesn't necessarily address. And for us to have a true system where people that where voting is at its maximum and the barriers to voting are broken down, you really have to pass all three, because again, you can't even pass just For the People Act and John Lewis without allowing people from DC to have statehood. So that's the message that we have sent in all our communications over the past few months. And then the last thing, while I have the floor really quickly, I want to say is that your senators are coming home soon. We expect them to be in town in DC, probably until possibly until the end of next week. But they will be home soon. And I know we are setting up key local coalition meetings with Republican senators to send the message to them that both the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act both need to be passed as soon as possible when they come back to DC in September. And I say that to say that we are including and want to include League of Women Voters local chapters as a part of those meetings. And so, for example, I know we're working in Pennsylvania to set up a meeting as soon as next week. Our next states are Nebraska and Missouri, and then we'll move on to North Carolina and South Carolina after that. So just want you to know to please be on the lookout for leadership conference, but also just other coalition members who will be setting up these meetings to go and meet in district with your senators around these bills.
Thanks so much, Jesselyn. And I did just want to elevate, somebody asked if there was a copy of the study that you referenced from earlier. I can be sure to include that in a follow-up email if you don't have the link right here, but I mean, I'll include it in a follow-up email no matter what.
Okay, yeah, Democracy Diverted, yeah, the report that so I can get that to you. But it's on our website. You might be able to pull it from our website if you need it, but maybe I'll try to find it.
Awesome. Again, if anyone feels free to speak up, but I wanted to raise another question. I was in the chat from Jennifer Martin about whether or not Senator Sinema supports these three bills. She is a co-sponsor on the For the People Act and did vote for it in June when it first came up. She is not currently a co-sponsor on the DC statehood bill. And because the Voting Rights Advancement Act hasn't come up in the Senate yet, there's no record of being a co-sponsorship. But I know we have Penny on the call from our Arizona League, who's also worked directly and a lot with our office. So I don't know if you know more about her support for the Voting Rights Advancement Act, but those are her two positions right now, currently on the DC statehood and on the For the People Act.
Dylan, would you like me to respond?
I mean, I called you out for a reason.
Okay, I wasn't sure. It's breaking up a little bit. So where we are with Senator Sinema, to following up on Jesselyn's work, we are trying our very best to organize an actual field hearing here with Senator Klobuchar, and we believe that, and they have been positive in their responses. We're trying to get our Senator Kelly, who has spoken in support of federal legislation, and we are working with the staff at Senator Sinema's. So Senator Sinema has not come out against the For the People Act, although she hides behind that she was the original sponsor. And I believe, Dylan, you said that she did not add her name to the John Lewis Act. Is that correct?
It's not been introduced yet, so she can't add her name specifically. And I don't know if she's made any public statements about it yet.
No, she has not made any public statements about either the For the People Act or the John Lewis Act. What she does come out in when there are any conversations in our staff is that she will come out in support of protecting the filibuster instead of addressing the questions directly. But she has not said, I don't support the For the People Act, and she has not said, I don't support the John Lewis Act, that we had a call with the Reform Jewish community with one of our staffers, and we asked that very pointed question. I will share with you all the answer we got was very, very troubling. And it was that, you know, if you pass these two acts and it's done with a slim majority, then it could be reversed. Well, you know, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but we did push back and say, if it was to be appealed in reverse, you would still need 60. So I think the fear of it could be reversed is not something she should be hiding behind. So we're starting to call her out on that, because that is her latest ploy when she's questioned, and her staff. And those of you who are not from Arizona, it is very, very frustrating for us. She really pivots and distracts away from a direct question of, you know, you supported For the People Act. Why aren't you lining up the 10 people? Or where are you on the John Lewis Act? And so that's where we are in Arizona. So to a direct answer, she hasn't come out against it, but none of her actions really make us confident that should it even come through a 50, you know, a filibuster avoidance move of some kind, that she will vote. That's where we are in our
Awesome.
assessment.
Thank you so much for that. That was very helpful. Does anyone else have any questions? I know we're at time, but I'm good to be here around for a few more minutes to answer any questions. I know there's another question in the chat, and I'll hold off on talking about that one. If anyone wants to chime in and ask their questions, just feel free to unmute yourself and start asking. Okay, well, people still think I'll do the last question that's in the chat. So I would like to actually direct this question over to my colleague, Alicia. Lisa says that she live in a state where their senators support both of all these acts. What weight does it carry to contact other senators in other states?
Yeah, thanks, Dylan, and thank you, Lisa, for this question. So we do a lot at the league. One, it's still important to contact your senators, even if they're in support, to let them know that, you know, thank you for supporting these bills and this legislation and making our democracy stronger and protecting the freedom to vote. We know that there are people in opposition and they're getting calls from them, but having this continuous support, like on the record, really does matter. The second thing that I would say is that I know, at least for me, I have friends who, you know, because I don't have a senator I can contact because I live in DC, but I have family who live in New Jersey, in Illinois, in Arizona, and West Virginia. And I have been talking to them and providing them resources for them to get engaged and contact their senators. So thinking about your personal networks and how to leverage them and bring them in is actually really powerful. It's not just about the messages that we promote, but it's also thinking about us as being strong messengers in our networks. Actually, a final thing that I would say, and we can include this in the follow-up email, but I know our partners at Common Cause, they have been leading phone banks to voters in other states, I think primarily in West Virginia, to contact voters and encourage them to talk to their senators. So this would be more of a cold outreach, but this is also something else that you can do. And Jesselyn, if I missed anything, please fill in the gaps. And like Ann Anderson said, if you have friends and relatives in other states, you can especially ask them to support things like DC statehood, where we need your help. But given that we are 4 minutes past time, really appreciate everybody's energy on this call. This is an exhaustive and important fight that is going to continue. And we'll be sure to send any information in a follow-up email that was referenced. So thank you all. And
Thank you. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you.
thanks so much, Jesselyn.
Thank you. Thank you.